My name is Bev York, and I'm the program director, as well, the education director here at the museum. And we are doing the Abraham Lincoln Gettysburg Address Challenge on this very special week. It's a very solemn occasion in American history because this was the week of the 150th commemoration of the death, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was shot on the 14th at Ford's Theater, and he died the morning of the 15th. So this is the 150th year. And we have just ended a 4-year commemoration of the American Civil War. The assassination of Lincoln was a few days after Lee surrenders. So the war had just ended, and Lee surrenders, and John Wilkes Booth and some other conspirators decided to take Lincoln's life. So here at the museum, we did a Civil War exhibit a few years ago. We did a reading of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we had some Civil War programs here. And this is our final program, I think, maybe not, but of commemorating this great event in American history. So this speech that Abraham Lincoln gave is 10 sentences. And it can be recited in two minutes. So and yet it was so powerful. When Abraham Lincoln gave this speech, he followed somebody who spoke for 2 hours. Now that might make us moan and groan, but before TV, people were used to long speeches and long sermons, and I think even had more patience maybe for the spoken word and the written word than people do today. But what has turned out, as this is Lincoln's speech, has become one of the most, if not the most famous speech in American history. And so I think it's really wonderful that some of you have taken to learn this. And I think most Americans can say 7 years ago, and that's as far as they get. But I'm so proud of you for taking this on. So I'd like to introduce to you our first group. We have a family with a friend, and our presentation is going to be by Samantha, Peter, Adriana, and Tina. And they're going to go first. So do you want to be in front of this table right here? You can use the podium. Absolutely use the podium.
And the music, we need 2 chairs.
And 2 chairs. Okay, well, come on up and get set up. Master of Ceremonies is also stage crew.
the Great Civil War, testing whether that nation or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure.
Lord of your sins, we cannot consecrate, cannot remember in the great battlefield of that war.
We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live.
But it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in larger sense, we cannot consecrate, we cannot dedicate, cannot consecrate, cannot hallow this ground.
Living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract.
The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task made before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom.
And that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
So proud of you. That was just wonderful. So I've just seen one that was better than any of the ones on YouTube. That was really, really wonderful. And I'm very, very proud of you. That was just terrific. That's great. Wow, that was really terrific. So we actually have a really another great performer here today, and Dr. Leslie Rickland, who is retired from Eastern Connecticut State University and was in the education department. She taught teachers. And one of the things that she did is she taught teachers to do very interesting things with her students to turn them on to history, like you do, Tina. And she also plays Mary Duffy. She has come as Mary Duffy, the Irish mill worker widow, and has done that here several years for some of our groups. So today, she is Victoria Woodhull. Now, if you don't know who that is, you're about to learn who that is. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Leslie Rickland as Victoria Woodhull.
Thank you so much for Mrs. York. That was a lovely introduction. Yes, I'm Victoria Claflin Woodhull. I come from New York City, and the year is 1872. So for me, the Gettysburg Address is just a mere 9 years ago. And President Lincoln's assassination was 7 years ago, when that dastardly deed was done by that coward John Wilkes Booth, and left us this wonderful legacy of freedom and equality. And that's why I thought I would be here today, because you probably have to look at my button a little bit more closely, but I am the first woman to run for president of the United States in 1872. My party is the Equal Rights Party, and my running mate, vice presidential candidate, is Mr. Frederick Douglass, the former slave and great orator. You may have heard of him. So we stand for equality, for women's rights, for women's equality, and suffrage for women. And for this, I am called the terrible siren, the Mrs. Satan. But you may also call me candidate for President of the United States. So I feel very proud to be here to recite the Gettysburg Address, a speech which I find perfect in every way except for maybe one, and I am going to enhance that speech with two little words, which you will probably note in the very beginning. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men and women are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field. We have come to the field to dedicate a portion. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as the final resting place for those who fought here that nation might live and gave their lives. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do so. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The great men, living and dead, who fought here, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is for us, rather, to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you very much.
That was really, really great. Oh.
Sorry, I messed it up a little.
Well, you don't have to, nobody knows. Look at all those people who aren't even trying in the back row there. No, that was truly wonderful.
It was good in my living room.
Oh, no, you did just great. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce to you Luzella and Peter Roos. They are very active volunteers here in the museum. In fact, Luzella and Peter are the vice president. Peter's vice president, and Luzella is president of our board of trustees. And so we are delighted to welcome you to the podium.
I think we just got shanghaied.
You did, and that was great.
Without practice.
Without
Okay.
practice. I've been away for a while. Okay.
Alternate
Okay.
sentences.
Alternate sentences? Okay, I'll start. 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition all men are created equal.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
We are met in the battlefield of that great war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those men who gave their lives the nation may live.
It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground.
The brave men who lived, I'm sorry, where am I at? I can't see that. Okay. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated far above our poor powers to add this track. The world will little note the long mean what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
Continue.
It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion.
That we here highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth.
Great, thank you very much. So, do we have one more presentation. Is there anybody else who hasn't signed up who's interested? Captain. Okay, this is another great surprise. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Ray Chaput. And Ray's nickname is Captain of the World because he was in the Navy and he went to many, many places in the world when he served in the Navy.
And I did the radio station Tuesday with Wayne on.
Yeah.
Some of you might have seen the album and the Chronicle. I've been doing the writing since last year. Got back to my writing, but actually I go back quite a few years. Anyways, I brought some pictures here with me, because again, with Abraham Lincoln on a float that we did at American Legion a few years ago on a boombox parade. So he was Buffa, right? That his name, Buffa? From Coventry. Yeah. Well, yeah. I had him on a float for the parade. And also, I'm related, believe it or not, I'm related to the Abraham Lincoln family. And they didn't, not directly, but anyway, Alfred is, his father is Lincoln. They live in the little village up here on 32. You know where the village is, right up there at the campground on 32. Well, the Lincoln family lived there. They're related to Abe Lincoln from, to the family. Well, one day I come home and somebody thinks I was drinking or something. Well, sure, you're really related to Abe Lincoln. Yeah, sure. So anyways, I come out on the porch, in the mailbox, there was a letter there, and I picked it up, and it says, Abe Lincoln invites you to his wedding. In fact, he married my second cousin. So that's right. Thank you.
Well, that's really great information to know that Ray is related to Abe Lincoln. The North Windham Cemetery actually has many, many different members of a local Lincoln family. In fact, I think the first name of North Windham was Lincolnville. Jamie, did you ever hear that? I remember reading that somewhere. Yes, Jean says yes. Okay, so I have some documented proof. If Jean says yes, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so one more presentation. We have Jamie Eves, and he is the executive director of our museum, and he has put together a special presentation on the Gettysburg Address.
So there's actually two things I'm going to do. And the thing that I actually wanted to do, and which I will do second, is I actually wanted to do the final few lines of the Gettysburg Address in more than one language, because it has been translated into all sorts of languages over time. As a teacher at Eastern Connecticut State University and at UConn, I sometimes teach the Gettysburg Address in my freshman U.S. history class, and what we deconstruct it is what we do, and we talk about what the actual meaning of it might be. Lincoln grew up on the frontier in an area where there were very few books, so the books that were there, that were available, were generally classics. They were the Bible, Shakespeare, and books of poetry, and things like that. So that when he grew up, like many people who grew up reading the same classical books over and over and over again, he tended to absorb the cadences of poetry. And so that his speeches tended to reflect that as well. His speeches are more poetical than those of virtually any other president. He labored long and hard over the structure of every speech. None of them were impromptu. They were well thought out. And what he attempted to do was, like most poets, in a very few number of words, to pack in as much meaning as he possibly could. So what I've done is I've got parallel columns, and this is what I hand out to my students, where we see the words of the Gettysburg Address, and then there's just some notes about how to interpret it that are in the right-hand column. As poetry, he used a lot of the themes of poetry. Occasionally in his speeches he uses rhyme, not in the Gettysburg Address, but in his famous second inaugural address, he says, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war shall speedily pass away." So he does lapse into poetry. The meter of poetry is there. He uses also a lot of alliteration, which is a poetical kind of thing. So fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth, and we get the F's all in a row that are there. Or a new nation with two N's that are in a row that would be there. And so there's a great deal of alliteration that's here as well. There's also something known as parallel construction, where essentially you use a series of phrases that are constructed grammatically the same way. You can use that in poetry or in prose, but it's commonly found in poetry. Another place where you will find a great deal of parallel construction is in Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. He uses that as well. One of the things that we have at the very beginning is brought forth on this new continent, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition. Brought forth, conceived in, dedicated to, three kinds of ideas introduced in a row in a form of parallel construction. And so that's right there at the very beginning as well. He also, in this speech, has something in mind. He's got a message. Partly what he was doing was he was dedicating the cemetery at Gettysburg as the first military cemetery in the United States. And so he was doing that. But also what he was doing, as he did in numerous other speeches that he gave throughout his presidency, was trying to explain to the American people what the Civil War was about. In particular, trying to explain to Northern people what the Civil War was about. He began his presidency by arguing that it was a war to preserve the Union, but as the war goes on, he finds other meanings for the war. One of the things that happens is a lot of people in the North said, well, let him go. Why not let him go? You know, no pain for us. You know, if the Confederacy goes, then we get rid of all of those people that we don't really want to have around anymore. They're happy, we're happy, we can do what we want. Why not just let them go? And so Lincoln, he realizes quickly in his presidency it's not enough to say we're doing this to preserve the Union. He has to explain why the Union must be preserved. He will have two reasons that he gives, both of which are alluded to in the Gettysburg Address. One is to end slavery, which he will make public following the Emancipation Proclamation, which was earlier in the year 1863. It's before the Gettysburg Address, is the Emancipation Proclamation. The other reason for preserving the Union is that he argues that unlike today, where we kind of consume that most people in the world live under Republican and Democratic regimes, the United States was the only democratic republic in existence in the 1860s. And the fear that Lincoln had, and the fear that a lot of people had, was that if the United States failed, if it didn't hold together, if it crumbled apart, that's the end for republicanism. That's the end for democracy. We might as well all go back to monarchies again, which is what most people lived in most places of the world. So he's arguing that the Civil War is about the future of all of the ideals for which the country was formed. And so in the first paragraph, he tries to tell people what those things were. And so he uses the term liberty, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that this is what democracy is all about. It's what republicanism is all about. So he introduces that in the first paragraph. He then goes on to talk about that he's there to give a dedication, and so right away he uses the term Civil War. This is not a war between the states to Mr. Lincoln. This is a civil war, and he wants to make that clear. And then he uses the word nation for the second time. He will use the word nation 5 times in just 3 paragraphs. That's a lot of times to use one word like that. And he's using it on purpose because he wants his audience to understand with him that the United States is not a confederation of states, that it's an actual real nation. And so he's using that time. He then goes on to say that the Civil War is a test about whether Republican, Democratic government could actually work, and that's what the war is about. He then goes on to say the purpose of the day is to dedicate the cemetery, and he mentions that. He wants to talk about the soldiers that have died because he is personally touched by every one of their sacrifices, and so he mentions them, and he mentions them repeatedly. And so that's part of what's there as well. There's more parallel construction that we're going to see. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. That's parallel construction. 3 phrases in a row with very similar language to them. It draws the attention of the listener to those phrases, and you notice them more than you would have noticed them in any other way. I've tried to, with underlinings, point out various examples of alliteration. World will. Little note nor long remember, 2 L's. Note nor, the 2 N's. What we. Again, is a form of alliteration that's there. Work which. So we find that, okay, there's that kind of alliteration is there. That too is a memory device. It helps make the words stick in the memory of anybody who hears or reads it. Then he uses the word dedicated, and he uses the word dedicated 3 times. Each time it means something different. And what he's doing is he is leading us from one idea to another idea to another idea, taking us from his initial thoughts to his final thoughts. So he first uses the word dedicated to talk about what the United States was all about, a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He then uses it in the sense of what they're doing that day in Gettysburg, that they're dedicating a cemetery to the memory of the soldiers who had fought and died there. And then later on, he will then use the word dedicated, meaning that we now must, as people who survived the battle and are surviving the war, we who are living must dedicate ourselves to preserving the United States and the things that he believes that it stands for. So he's carrying you from the dedication of a cemetery to the dedication that he wants people to have, the resolve he wants his listeners to have to move forward to what he is now calling the great task that's remaining for people. And which brings us to the conclusion that is there, that the nation, and he's using this term, shall have a new birth of freedom. And he just stops there. He doesn't tell you what he means by a new birth of freedom. But in 1863, you didn't have to say what you meant by freedom. Everybody knew whose freedom was at stake in the Civil War, and this is the freedom of the slaves. And so he is bringing in this idea of freeing the slaves. In other speeches, he would be more explicit that he means that. But that's what he means by this. This is a new birth of freedom. What he's done now is in this last line gone back to the first line. So he talked initially about the birth of the United States. Now he's talking about a new birth in the United States, the birth of freedom for everybody who lives there. And in the first paragraph, he talked about conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and now he wants to sum up what he thinks that means and what's at stake. And so he says, and you can pick out the alliteration yourselves, you don't need me to do that here, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, in other words, democracy, republicanism, shall not perish from the earth. Those are pretty great stakes, that this war is a struggle then, not just for the future of one country, but the future of all people. On the back, this is what I actually set out to do when I started this, is I wanted to take the words and put them into more than one language, and I didn't have to do that myself. The internet did it for me. The internet is wonderful. It gives you all sorts of things. This wasn't a translating program. The Gettysburg Address has been translated into pretty much every language you can think of. And it was translated into multiple languages within only a few weeks of the time that he gave the speech. Speeches in those days were reprinted in newspapers, so it immediately appears in numerous newspapers in the United States in English. But what historians have discovered is that it then pops up in Paris, in Berlin, in Rome, in Milan, and in all sorts of other places. The European countries first, and then slowly moving off into other countries around the world. Pretty much any country that had a newspaper and had people who were working to create republics and democracies. Were interested in translating this speech and other speeches of Lincoln's, but this one was translated all over the world. So what I wanted to do, and I don't have a good enough memory to do it, so I'm going to be reading it, is I wanted to just do the last lines, and I can't do it in every language. I actually found out that the United Nations, well, once a number of years ago, published an edition of the Gettysburg Address, a whole pamphlet where each page is in a different language. And I found it, it's out of print now, but it's been scanned and it's on the internet, and I found it. And actually, I've got it here, and I'll pass it around for anybody who'd like to see it. The first page is Vietnamese. And as you look through it, you can see why I'm not making any attempt to read the Arabic version. It's not in our alphabet, or the Hindi version. But I have the English, the French, the Spanish, the German, and the Italian. That for me, the Spanish and Italian is hard. I don't know Spanish or Italian, so this has been a hard practice. And forgive me if I mispronounce a word or two. I did try to get some help from people who speak those languages. I did it sometime in the past, study French and German, so the pronunciation might be a little better there. Although in one trip I took to Quebec, somebody told me that they thought I had the worst French accent they had ever heard. It might not come out good. So the last line is, of course, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Le gouvernement du peuple, par le peuple et pour le peuple ne disparaîtra jamais de la surface de la terre. In the French, it says never. The Spanish says, El gobernador de pueblo por el pueblo y para el pueblo no desperanza de la faz de la tierra. In German, I have to turn my mouth around to do German. It's just you don't do it the way you do any other language. So let's see. Und diejenige Staatsform, in welcher das Volk allein durch das Volk zum Besten des Volkes herrscht, nicht von der Erde verschwindet. You have to shout German, it just comes out. And my bad attempt to do an Italian accent, just because I think Italian sounds cool when I listen to it. Un governero del popolo, da popolo, per il popolo non abbia a parere dalla terra.
Wow, Jamie, that was really great. Wow, your accents are really good. You need to. Yeah, Meryl Streep should be worried. That was really great. Thank you. So we had some really varied and interesting presentations today, and I think it was all great. I'm so proud of you, and thank you for participating. We have a large panel of judges in the back, and they have come. Everybody looks. Yeah. And Meryl Streep has just left. And so we have some, we'd like to award some ribbons to those of you who spent a lot of time working on this. That was really great. So, first, the idea was that you could enter either as reading this or as memorizing this. And look at what they did to memorize this. It's just amazing. So, we have an adult division, and our adult winner, first place, is Victoria Woodhull. So, you were tremendous.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm embarrassed, but thank you very much.
Oh, don't be embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed. That was really great. Thank you very much for teaching us that history.
As a little addition, I can attest that it went perfectly in the living room.
They always do, don't they?
It went perfectly in the shower. Perfectly on the back terrace. So let's not do that.
She was too busy campaigning of her own campaign to think about the safety.
No, that was really great. That was really, truly great.
Fantastic.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, our family plus Samantha, I think we were all blown away by what these folks did. So come on up. So this is Peter Mazza. So Peter, tell us how old you are now. 12. Wow. Great job. And playing the keyboard. And this is Samantha Smith, friend of Adriana's. And you did great. Thank you so much for coming. And Adriana Mazza. Very good. Wonderful job. And the mom who gets her kids involved in a lot of great things. They also did a shirt contest. We had a contest of t-shirts. And they did a wonderful, wonderful job. So here you go, Mom, first place. And I'm thrilled that you have all come here today. I think this was a great program, and you've given up one of the best days of spring to come here, but late in the day, beautiful weather outside, to come and do something and learn about something that is really, really important for Americans to know. So I'm pleased and proud of all of you, our performers, and our audience.